and to all of you for being here this morning. I appreciate your interest in dying with dignity and medical assistance in dying in particular, and the warm welcome of your fellowship. So I'm going to screen share so you'll be able to see my slides, and I'm going to turn off my video. Let's see how this is going to work. And let's see. Okay. Can everybody see that?
Yes, we can, Chantal.
Okay, great. Thank you. So just a note about this pandemic that we are living through. It's been over a year now that we've all been trying to struggle through it. And I know it's been a challenge for all of us, and almost seems to be getting more of a challenge as we get closer and closer to vaccinations being available. And I do hope that you and your families are all doing as well as possible, and that you will get vaccinations soon. So stay tuned. So these are my affiliations, and while I am affiliated with these organizations, the views I'm expressing today are my own and are not intended to represent any of them. In terms of disclosures, I do occasionally receive fees for lectures, but otherwise I have no disclosures or conflicts of interest that I'm aware of. And this morning, what I'd like to talk to you a bit about is how I became a MAID provider and why, and give you a brief overview of the history of MAID in Canada, though it sounds like most of you probably know much of it. I'll go over the MAID legislation and the changes that are coming in Bill C7, and in particular the Senate amendments and the House response to them, and a few words about the parliamentary review that was supposed to start. And interspersed will be some case examples and some quotations from patients. So MAID has been legal in Canada now for almost 5 years, and during this time over 14,000 people have received MAID, about 6,882 in Ontario, with 39 in Lambton County as of the end of January 2021. But many more have had indirect experience with it through friends or family members who have received it, or in some cases by signing, being a witness to the request for MAID that patients have to sign. However, there are still many, many people, including many medical practitioners, who know very little or nothing about MAID and are not aware that this is a legal end-of-life option that's available. And I'm always appreciative of invitations like this one to share information about MAID. And as Alan mentioned, I am a family physician and psychotherapist practicing in Toronto. And one of my main goals as a physician over more than 35 years of practice has been to help my patients to live the best lives they can according to their values, principles, and goals. As Catherine Mannix has written, as we live longer, thanks to modern medicine, it is our years of old age that are extended, not our years of youth and vigor. It's important to recognize that death is not the worst or even the only bad thing that can happen to the elderly. We need to focus on care and not cure in the elderly or in those with chronic treatment-resistant conditions, as much of what ails them is not curable, is not fixable, but has to be endured. Medical assistance in dying is the administering by a medical practitioner or nurse practitioner of a substance to a person at their request that causes their death. Catherine Mannix also asks, when is a suicidal idea simply an acceptance of reality? I want to understand where the line is between being a person who accepts a life-threatening condition and being suicidal. And this is an important distinction that we need to consider as part of any assessment process for MAID. Refusing CPR, a defibrillator, or other life-saving measures is not suicidal. It is self-preservation according to one's values and principles. One can love being alive, cherish every moment, and still have a complete plan for how one's dying will be managed. Assisted dying is but one of the end-of-life care options we have to consider, and patients should be adequately informed of all of them so that they may make their own choice, their own decision. So becoming a MAID provider, why do this work? I'm often asked how or why I became a MAID assessor and provider, and in the beginning, it just made sense to me. I am a physician and have the privilege of providing patients with care, and I thought if I could do this work, I should. I also think perhaps that to not do this work is unthinkable. I am pro-life, believing that life is precious and to be savored and enjoyed, whatever that looks like or means to an individual. And I am pro-choice. I've been a longstanding advocate of choice in healthcare, in all aspects of healthcare, including choice at the end of life and dying with dignity. I encourage all patients in my practice to make wills and put powers of attorney in place, regardless of their ages, to help them have as much direction of their own healthcare as possible. When it became clear that assisted dying was going to become legal in Canada, I thought that I should be that I should be involved if I could be. But the question I asked myself was, could I do this work? And I really wasn't sure. So in 2015, I set out exploring what it would mean to me to provide MAID and how I would learn to do it. Through Dying with Dignity Canada, I was connected with colleagues in British Columbia who were also interested in becoming MAID assessors and providers. And early in 2016, Dying with Dignity provided an educational session with some colleagues who had gone to the Netherlands and to the US to learn about experiences there. We essentially had to teach ourselves, as there were no guidelines in Canada at that point. Also in 2016, the Canadian Association of MAID Assessors and Providers, or CAMAP, was founded in British Columbia and now includes over 300 members across the country. We support, advise, and mentor each other, and it's a tremendous source of support. In addition to the professional development and preparation I did, I also discussed my potential involvement in MAID with my family. I wanted them to be aware that there may be implications for them in my doing this work. I'll go through a brief history of MAID in Canada. In 1992, Sue Rodriguez was a 42-year-old woman suffering from amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. She argued that the prohibition on assisted suicide violated her rights under Section 7 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. She took her challenge to the Supreme Court of Canada and lost in 1993 in a very close 5-4 vote. She died in 1994 by suicide. She famously said, quote, "If I cannot give consent to my own death, whose body is this? Who owns my life?" Between 1991 and 2014, 9 bills were brought to Parliament and the Senate, which all sought in some form to decriminalize assisted death, but all of them failed. In June 2014, the Quebec government passed Bill 52, an act respecting end-of-life care, making Quebec the first jurisdiction in Canada to allow assisted deaths. Then on February 6, 2015, the Supreme Court of Canada struck down the criminal code provisions prohibiting assisted suicide in what came to be called the Carter decision. It was a unanimous decision in which the court decided that the current federal law did violate the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. On June 17, 2016, Bill C-14, an act to amend the criminal code and to make related amendments to other acts, came into force. The act creates exemptions to certain criminal offenses in order to allow eligible Canadians to access medical assistance in dying, and that's the legislation we're currently operating under. I did my first MAID assessment in July 2016 and have been actively assessing, providing, and mentoring clinicians since then. I won't go into details, but I can tell you that the process of assessing and providing MAID to my first patient was an amazing experience and a privilege. The patient and his family welcomed me into their home, were actively involved in the process, and created a calm and peaceful environment for him. His death itself, which he welcomed, was eager to achieve, and which he approached with a kind of joy and calm, was also very peaceful, and he died with loving family and friends around him. I was very fortunate that he was my introduction to MAID provision. Each patient since then has been different, but they are remarkably usually happy and eager to be finally receiving MAID. Each death has been a different experience, but each has been a privilege to participate in, and there is no question in my mind that I can do this work. I am grateful to live in Canada where delivering this kind of compassionate care is possible, where patients can be treated with respect and dignity right up until their final breath. As I mentioned, patients are often very happy and excited when I call to make an appointment, and even when I arrive on the day of the MAID procedure. And these are not responses that I had initially expected, but they no longer surprise me. Quote, "I'm so happy you called. Oh my God, I'm going to live for that day. God bless you." Quote, "I would love that," meaning a MAID assessment. Quote, "I'm so excited." And that was to be receiving MAID. That was on the day of her MAID eligibility or her MAID procedure. Now, you have already heard from Susan Desjardins from Dying with Dignity Canada, who spoke last fall, as Alan mentioned, and she spoke about the legislation and the eligibility criteria, so I'm not going to review them in any detail. The federal government introduced Bill C-7, a revision of Bill C-14, in February 2020 as a response to the Truchon decision of September 2019, in which Justice Baudouin in Quebec found that the criterion of reasonably foreseeable natural death violated the plaintiff's charter rights and struck it down. She gave the federal government time to draft new legislation. The government tabled legislation in February 2020, but subsequently has asked for and received 4 extensions. As of now, the deadline is March 26th, and we're hoping it will come into force then. I'll go through a summary of the changes that were put forth in Bill C-7 in response to the Truchon decision. This amendment to the criminal code would repeal the eligibility criterion that requires a person's natural death be reasonably foreseeable. It would exclude persons explicitly whose sole underlying medical condition is a mental illness. It would permit MAID to a person who has lost the capacity to consent, but under very specific confined circumstances. And this part is known as Audrey's Amendment, after Audrey Parker in Halifax, who died before she'd wanted to because she feared losing capacity. This change will also enhance the monitoring regime to add collection of more data, so we have a better understanding of who across the country has been receiving MAID. And it will reduce the number of independent witnesses to the patient's written request for MAID from 2 to 1, and that person can be a paid caregiver of the patient, though not one of the MAID assessors. Bill C-7 also introduces new safeguards. So while it removes the idea of natural death being reasonably foreseeable from an eligibility criterion, it's moved it now to a safeguard. And the new bill will create 2 pathways to MAID for those who are found eligible, depending on whether their natural death is reasonably foreseeable or not. If the person's death is reasonably foreseeable, there will be no longer a mandatory 10-day reflection period. And Audrey's amendment applies, which again means that someone could sign a consent in advance that would allow for a waiver of final consent on the day of MAID. At this point, a person has to have capacity to consent to MAID on the time of the procedure. If the person's death is not reasonably foreseeable, this bill will add a mandatory 90-day assessment period. Now, it's not a reflection period, it's an assessment period during which a broader assessment is supposed to be taking place. It also adds that if one of the assessors does not have expertise in the condition that the patient has, a clinician with expertise must be consulted. It requires serious consideration of reasonable means to relieve the suffering of the patient. It also requires that the person be informed of available counseling services, mental health and disability support services, community services, and palliative care. Quote, "The quality of an individual's life can really only be measured by that person." One of the biggest challenges in providing MAID over the past almost 5 years now is telling patients who desperately want MAID that they are not eligible. And while I support a person's right to die at a time of their choosing when they are ready, I adhere very closely to the eligibility criteria. Unfortunately, these restrictive criteria under both the original Bill C-14 and the newly proposed Bill C-7 exclude and will continue to exclude many people. Quote, "I feel terror, absolute terror at the thought of having to continue to live." Quote, "It's not easy for me to ask for this help." Quote, "I don't want to suffer anymore. I suffered so much in my life, I've had enough. Why do I have to go on?" Another challenge in providing MAID is that there is considerable variability in how assessors and providers interpret the meanings of reasonably foreseeable natural death, intolerable suffering, and decline in capability. And this has not been clarified in the new bill, meaning that some people will be found eligible by some assessors, but would have been found eligible by others. Many patients don't know that they are entitled to have more than one assessment, and if so they're denied eligibility by one assessor, they can ask for further assessments and even more than one assessment. So being denied eligibility leads some patients to go to Switzerland at great cost, or to commit suicide, or to suffer immeasurably through a natural death. Donna Mae Hill was one of those people. She was a 90-year-old woman whose family took her to Switzerland in May of 2018 to receive an assisted suicide after she was deemed ineligible here in Ontario. When this hit the news, many assessors and providers were shocked that she had not been referred for another assessment here, as was her right. Many of us would have found her eligible, thus saving her the further pain, suffering, and anxiety of a trip to Switzerland, not to mention the more than $30,000 that this costs. She should have been able to die in the comfort of her own home, surrounded by her family. Likewise, there was a recent media report of a woman in Ontario who was told she would not be eligible for MAID, so she didn't even apply. She died by suicide, alone in a hotel room, rather than surrounded by her grieving but loving family who had supported her quest for MAID. When her story hit the news again, many of us thought she would have been found eligible had she had an assessment by an experienced MAID assessor. Which leads me to another challenge, which is finding an assessor and provider. Not all physicians and nurse practitioners support MAID, and some believe that participating in the MAID process is a violation of their conscience rights. This can make it difficult for patients to find an assessor and thus access MAID. For this reason, the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Ontario and the College of Nurses of Ontario have policies on effective referral. But in spite of this, I have assessed too many patients over the past 4.5 years whose physicians told them that they would have nothing to do with MAID and refused outright to help them, or who told them that they would make a referral only to never be heard from again. It can be particularly difficult for patients in rural or remote areas to access MAID. Quote, "When I feel like I'm doing more dying than living, I'll make the choice that's best for me." Quote, "No pill can take away the pain of waking up each day and remembering all over again that you are about to die." So as it has been mentioned, right now, Bill C7 is going through the government stages of, it's gone from the House to the Senate and now back to the House again. The House and the Senate invited people from across the country to provide testimony during their deliberations of Bill C7, and I was privileged to be invited to speak to the Senate and offer my recommendations for changes to Bill C7. So I did. I asked that they remove the concept of reasonably foreseeable natural death from the legislation altogether, both from the eligibility criteria and the safeguards, and in so doing, remove the proposed two-pathway system. I think this new two-pathway system is going to be very cumbersome and is going to be much more difficult for patients and certainly much more difficult for clinicians. I ask that they allow for a waiver of final consent for any patient who has been assessed and approved for MAID, with no requirement that a date for MAID be set, and no requirement that the person must be recognized to be at risk of loss of capacity. Anybody can be at risk of loss of capacity, not just because of their underlying illness, but someone could have a stroke, that it could have a sudden heart attack that affects brain function. They could be in an accident. So that if that happened at this point, under these circumstances, that person would not be eligible for MAID. I ask that they remove the exclusion of people whose sole underlying medical condition is mental illness, as that is stigmatizing and discriminatory to people living with mental illness and likely unconstitutional. I supported keeping the one independent witness safeguard for the signed request, as I think that is adequate. I asked that they remove the requirement in the not reasonably foreseeable natural death pathway, if the two-pathway system is maintained, that a clinician with expertise in the condition be consulted. In doing any medical assessment, whether for MAID or other situations, we do consult as needed. The need for consultation should be a clinical, not a legislated decision. I ask that they keep the safeguard requiring that the person be informed of all means available to relieve their suffering, but remove the requirement that the practitioner agree that the person has given serious consideration to those means, as no one can really know with any certainty the thoughts or deliberations of another person. But a person certainly should be aware of all the options available to them so that they're making a truly informed decision. I ask that they remove the waiting period and the assessment period altogether and allow assessments to take as much or as little time as is necessary for the assessors and providers to come to a clinical decision about the person's eligibility. Again, I think this should be a clinical decision and not something that's legislated. Some assessments will take a very short amount of time and others will take much longer, in some cases more than 90 days. And I think we should just be able to take whatever time is needed to do a proper assessment. I ask that the legislation allow MAID by advance request, like through an advance directive or other document, with or without a grievous and irremediable condition diagnosed at the time the directive is written. I ask that the legislation require effective referrals from all clinicians. And I ask that the legislation require that clinicians initiate discussion about MAID in all end-of-life care options discussions, thus providing patients with the information they need to make truly informed decisions. Someone who has never heard of MAID has no ability to ask about it, let alone to ask for it. So the Senate did make a number of amendments, which they sent to the House, most of which were rejected outright by the House or modified. The Senate amended the bill to include an 18-month sunset clause on the bill's explicit prohibition on medical assistance in dying for those with mental illness. The House kept the idea of a sunset clause, but extended it to 24 months. The Senate amended the bill to clarify that the mental illness exclusion does not apply to those with neurocognitive disorders, including Alzheimer's, dementia, Parkinson's, and Huntington's, and other conditions, but this was rejected. So this leaves patients with those conditions perhaps to be found not eligible because their conditions in medicine do fall under the umbrella of mental illness. The Senate amended the bill to allow for advance requests and extend the waiver of final consent to those whose death is not reasonably foreseeable. This was rejected. The Senate amended the bill to require collection of race-based data for all people who request and receive MAID, and a version of this will likely be accepted, perhaps adding more data to be collected. The Senate added an amendment that a comprehensive review of the provisions of the criminal code related to MAID and their applications be undertaken. So as you can see, we are far from having good access to MAID for suffering Canadians who would seek it. An IPSOS poll of 3,500 Canadians just published last week found that 69% support removing the reasonably foreseeable requirement from the law, 78% support adding a waiver of final consent provision, 83% support advance request for those with a grievous and irremediable condition, and 76% support advance request even if no grievous and irremediable condition exists. 65% support access to MAID for those whose sole condition is a mental illness, and 64% support access to MAID for mature minors. The data also showed that a majority of every demographic studied, including age, identifying as part of the BIPOC community, those in the LGBTQ2S+ community, across religious and political affiliations, and amongst the disabilities community, all support MAID in every scenario that was presented to them. And I mentioned briefly earlier that when the original legislation, Bill C-14, came into effect, there was a mandatory review to be done starting within 5 years. And this was to have started in June 2020, but has not yet begun. The review is supposed to look at the inclusion of advanced requests for MAID, requests where mental illness is the sole underlying condition, and requests by mature minors. And it's unlikely now that MAID legislation is going to be reopened again at least for several more years. So people currently denied access under Bill C-14 and under the new Bill C-7 will be forced to suffer much longer. So what keeps me going? I continue to do this work because of the patients and families I have helped, and for all Canadians who deserve the right to die with dignity and in peace. Each patient has their own story, their own history, their own very personal reasons for seeking MAID. I'm often asked if I find this work hard or depressing, and yes, it is hard, but no, it is anything but depressing. I am deeply touched by the outpouring of love, appreciation, and gratitude patients and their families express to me throughout. MAID is still very new, and we don't have much experience with knowing the date and time of death. There is no patient and family script for how to do a MAID death, and often what happens evolves over the period of time it takes to do the assessments and put everything in place logistically. I've had procedures with patients surrounded by people having a wonderful party, and procedures where I'm the only person with the patient and everything in between. It is the patients and their families that keep me going. As I say to all my patients and families, it takes a lot of courage to choose MAID, and it takes a lot of courage and love to support a loved one through MAID. A final challenge I'll mention is, where is MAID provided? Most MAID procedures are provided that I do are provided in people's homes, but many people would prefer not to die at home for a variety of reasons. Some people are underhoused and have no privacy where they're living, and some have no home or safe place to receive MAID. So what are their alternatives? Well, we have hospitals, but they're difficult to access and not very warm and welcoming places to receive MAID or to die. We have hospices, but they're often run by religious organizations which prohibit MAID on the premises, or by palliative care providers who do not accept MAID as an end-of-life care option. And because of this, a group of us came together in 2017 to create MAID House, as Alan mentioned. And we have been actively putting together the infrastructure and fundraising to be able to open MAID House. MAID House will be a warm, welcoming place, a dedicated facility where patients may go to receive MAID from their chosen provider at a date and time of their choosing. Our inaugural executive director started in January, and the first MAID House will be located in Toronto, where we're actively searching for space now. We hope to open doors this year, and we hope there will be other MAID houses across the country in the future. A good death is a continuation of a good life. I thank you again for inviting me this morning, and I look forward to your questions.